Hello guys, welcome to IB360. In this video we are going to study about the types of vectors. So if you haven't watched our previous videos of vectors, there will be a link above you. That link consists of a playlist. Do watch that videos, then come to this video. Your concepts will be cleared. So with that said, let's just get started. So we need to know about two specific types of vectors in proceeding forward in the chapter of vectors. Okay, so these types of vectors are the parallel vectors and the anti-parallel vectors. There are many types of vectors, okay, but we specifically need to know about these two types of vectors. So what are parallel vectors? Okay, so suppose this be a vector. Okay, so suppose this be a vector, suppose this vector is a1 vector. Okay, so we write vectors in form of letters. We write the letter and give a vector sign over the letter. So this vector be a1 vector. Okay, and suppose there is another vector. Okay, suppose this be the vector, suppose this is the a2 vector. Okay, a2 vector. Okay, so that means these two vectors will be called parallel vectors when they are parallel to each other. See, these two vectors are parallel to each other. Why? Because see, this vector, arrowhead of the vector is pointing in the east direction, right? Similarly, this arrowhead of the vector of the second vector is also pointing towards the east vector, right? So that means they are pointing both in the same direction. So that means they are parallel vectors. So parallel vectors will point in the same direction. Okay, so now coming to the anti-parallel vectors. So what are anti-parallel vectors? Suppose I have two vectors. Suppose this be a1 vector and this be our a2 vector. So when they will be anti-parallel vectors, when they will point in the opposite direction, in the opposite direction, right? So that means see, in the case a1 is pointing where? Is pointing towards the east, right? And a2 is pointing towards the west because the arrowhead is pointing towards the west, right? So that means see, one is pointing towards the east and the other is pointing towards the west, right? And east or west are opposite directions. So that means they will be our a1 and a2 will be our anti-parallel vectors. Okay, so over here we need to know about few things more. So we know the directions are north, south, east and west, right? So north and south are opposite vectors. Why? Because anti-parallel vectors. Why? Because north is pointing in this direction, right? Arrowhead is pointing in this direction, while the south vector is pointing in the opposite direction to the north vector, right? So that means north and south are your anti-parallel vectors, right? So that means I can write that. So for anti-parallel vectors I can write a1 vector is equal to negative of a2 vector. It's only valid for anti-parallel vectors. Okay, and for parallel vectors I can write a1 vector is equal to your a2 vector. Okay, so that means since north and south are your anti-parallel vectors, I can write that north vector is equal to the negative of south vector from this relation, right? Taking north as a vector, right? And also I can write that east vector, see, east and west are also your anti-parallel vectors. Why? Because east vector is pointing, arrowhead is pointing in this direction, and for the west vector the arrowhead is pointing in the opposite direction. So that means east and west are also your anti-parallel vectors, right? So that means I can also write that east will be your negative of west. Okay, so that means I hope you got the concept of parallel vectors and anti-parallel vectors. Okay, so now coming to the adding of the two vectors. Okay, so we will see how will you add the two vectors. Okay, so that means over here it says that a force of 10 Newton is acting in the east and the force of 30 Newton is acting in the west. Okay, first of all construct the first vector. So a1 vector will be how much? So this will be your a1 vector, right? So this, the magnitude will be of the vector will be 10 Newton, and in which direction the arrowhead will be pointing? In the east direction, right? So that means in this direction. So this is your a1 vector. Okay, so I can also write a1 vector in terms of, in this terms also, that a1 vector will be 10 Newton towards the, a1 vector will be 10 Newton towards the east. I can write a1 vector in this way also. Okay, so now and a force of 30 Newton is acting in the west. Okay, so there is over here, suppose this be this 30 Newton. Okay, so suppose this magnitude represents 30 Newton and is acting in the west, right? So that means arrowhead is pointing towards the west. So that means I can write over here a2 vector also is nothing but how much? 30 Newtons, but in the west direction, right? We are writing vectors, right, in this manner. Okay, so we have to find the net force. So what will be the net force? The net force will be nothing but a1 vector plus a2 vector. Okay, so a net means you just sum up the two vectors. Okay, so the net vector will be, a vector will be equal to your a1 vector plus a2 vector, right? So that means this can be written as 10 Newtons towards the east plus 30 Newtons towards the west, right? Now I can write, since east and west are your anti-parallel vectors, I can write that, I can write east is your negative of west, right? From the previous part we studied. So that means this will be your minus 10 Newton towards the west plus 30 Newtons towards the west, which is equal to how much? 20 Newtons towards the west. So that means the adding up, the net force which will be found by adding up the two vectors, the net force will be found by adding up the two vectors, will be directed 20 meter in the west, 20 Newtons in the west. Okay, so I hope you got the question on how we are adding up the vectors. We are just summing up the vectors and specifying the east and west directions. Okay, so in this question it's stating that a force of 35 Newton is acting in the east and the force of 65 Newton is acting in the west. We have to find the net force. Okay, so that means the first vector will be how much? First force vector will be 35 Newton acting in the east, right? And the second force vector will be how much? I'm just writing it. Okay, I'm not drawing. It will be 65 Newton towards the west. So what will be the net force? The net force will be a1 plus a2, right? What will the net, whenever you see net, you just sum it up. So that means this will be 35 Newton towards the east plus 65 Newton towards the west, right? And again, using the same concept, we know that east is actually how much? Negative of west, because east and west are anti-parallel vectors. So that means over here I can specify minus 35 Newton towards the west plus 65 Newtons towards the west. So that means we'll get how much? We'll get 30 Newtons towards the west. So this will be our net force. Okay, I hope you got the question. So in the next question, it is stating that a man went 20 meters in the north direction. So then 30 meter in the south and again 40 meter in the north. Okay, so that means the first vector will be how much? 20 meter in the north direction, right? Then he walked 30 meter in the south. So that means the second vector will be how much? Second vector will be 30 meter but in the south direction. Okay, and then he again walk 40 meter in the north. So the third vector will be how much? 40 meter towards the north. So these are all the three displacement vectors, right? So how can you find the net displacement? The net displacement D is actually the sum of the displacement vectors, individual displacement vectors. So that means this will be A1 vector plus A2 vector plus A3 vector. So okay, so that means the net displacement of the man will be 20 meter towards the north plus 30 meter towards the south plus 40 meters towards the north, right? So that means the net displacement, see again, north and south are anti-parallel vectors, so north will be written as negative of south, right? North will be written as a negative of south. So that means I can write that over here 20 meters towards the north plus 30 meter. Okay, south can be written as, over here again, south can be written as negative of north, right? South can be written as negative of north. So that means this will be minus of north plus 40 meters towards the north, right? So that means if you just sum it up, you will get that 20 plus 40 is how much? 60. 60 minus 30 is 30. 30 meters towards the north. So that means the net displacement of the man is how much? Is 30 meters towards the north. So I hope you got the questions. So thank you for watching. We'll be coming with more and more videos on vectors. So stay tuned, subscribe the channel, share the channel, and thank you. Stay safe.